Normally, Rahim, we would offer you a lei here in Hawaii, but since we're on Zoom, the best that I could do for you is to offer you my voice. So this is a chant of welcoming and thanks. It talks about flowers being strung together, bringing the wisdom of our elders and offering it to you. Ele kale. Ele kale. Hele ala, hele hiva hiva, hele kini puae, kuia li ike aloha. Holu ya e kapule kau ki e kalani. Kalapua mai ka aina I ho'olaia e nā kupuna. Ea ka wehi o ka lahui. Hele I ola oa e. Aloha no.
Aloha.
Thank you. That was so beautiful.
Okay, with that, I think we should start. Beautiful. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you very much.
Okay, before I introduce our guest, which we are delighted to have today with us, I'd really like to take a brief moment to locate this conversation in the context and on the spectrum of everything that's going on. I want to mention two things. One is that it is the choices that we make that have tremendous influence. And so I'd like to acknowledge everything that we do, like being here on this conversation and many other things that we do that might seem a little bit small, but they make all the difference that we need. So I call you to keep up the good work and to believe in that this is all the difference that we need to make. The second thing I really would like to mention is that we often in our activity and activism get a little bit unaligned from the initial passion that made us do all of this work. So we get caught up in the current of what's going on in life. And so we find ourselves taken to the streets and protesting. But sometimes our work doesn't really reflect on where we need to go, although our intentions and goals are clear. So this is where I want to raise the question of, are we progressing? Are we actually making progress, or are we just doing activism? And the reason why this is an important question, or this question is important enough that we are having this conversation in order to try to close the gap between where we want to go and how we can utilize our energy and time the most with what actually generated it. So I don't want to speak much about this, but I just wanted to raise this thought and kind of have it around as we listen to our guest, which I would like to introduce. This event and conversation is to complete Decolonial November, which happens every year. It's an annual event that is massive solidarity with the Palestinians across the nation and internationally. And secondly, and excitingly, it is the inauguration and the beginning of a new series that I am and we as FJP are so excited to announce that it's going to be called Palestine Speaks, or Speaking Palestine. And this series is going to exclusively feature Palestinian voices on a regular basis, aiming to close this gap that I just mentioned. And we can talk a lot more about this. Thank you for being here. And to introduce our guest, without further ado, Our guest, Lubnah Shomali, is coming all the way from Palestine. She's the advocacy manager at BADIL Resource Center and Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. She is a community activist and a human rights activist. And it's an honor to have you today. And I can't wait to hear more about BADIL and more you work. I personally have witnessed it on the ground, and it is really encouraging and uplifting. So please take us there. Thank you so much. Oh, Lubna, you're muted.
Sorry. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank Ma'an and Cindy for organizing this, and Ma'an for reaching out to me, and SFJP for organizing this series of webinars. It's definitely a step in the right direction because we do need to elevate the Palestinian voice as much as possible. And that is becoming more and more difficult. And we'll talk about that maybe later in the discussion. I'm going to do this is I'm going to start off with some slides to kind of give you some basic information about BADIL, the refugee situation, which is the issue that we specialize in, and talk a little bit about the obstacles that refugees face. And then I'm going to veer off a little, well, not veer off, but then I'm going to tackle some other issues like what Palestinian organizing looks like, some of the obstacles that we face as organizations in terms of how we operate and how we work. I'm going to try to connect our struggle with other struggles around the world, or show where those connections are. And maybe talk a little bit about what international solidarity with the Palestinian people should look like, or what we envision it to look like. So I'll start with the slides now. BADIL Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights was established in 1998, 5 years after Oslo. And the reason being is that even at that time, the Palestinian refugee community, both in mandatory Palestine or historic Palestine and abroad, were very dissatisfied with Oslo. And when I say dissatisfied, it's kind of an understatement. The Oslo Accords pushed the refugee issue to final status negotiations. And the way BADIL feels, and the reason BADIL was established, is because we believe that the refugee issue, or the issue of ongoing displacement and dispossession of the Palestinian people, is the core issue. And all the other issues are kind of linked to this issue or reliant on this issue. But the focus or the foundation of the conflict is the ongoing displacement and dispossession of the Palestinian people and the denial of their right of return. So BADIL, the name, actually means alternative. And so when we were created in 1998 at the request of the refugee community, we were created as an alternative to Oslo, or an alternative to the peace process as we know it. BADIL is a human rights organization. We do not do humanitarian aid and assistance. We do not do development work. We are a human rights organization that is specifically devoted to promoting and defending the rights of the Palestinian people, particularly those who have been or will be displaced. Now, when I say have been and will be displaced, that means everybody. So and this is because we have a significant history of ongoing displacement and dispossession, and this was actually exemplified or manipulated by the Zionist movement, which began in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The way BADIL describes the conflict, or the way we frame the conflict within an international legal framework, uses different terminology and describes it in a different way than what we see in the current international discourse. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. For BADIL, we describe the conflict as an ongoing Nakba. The situation in Palestine is not just about the Nakba that occurred in 1948. And I hope that everyone is familiar with that term Nakba, which means catastrophe. And it's usually used to describe the period from about 1947 to about 1950, in which the largest wave or the greatest number of Palestinians became refugees and internally displaced persons. The way BADIL uses the term ongoing Nakba is to describe the continuous displacement and dispossession of the Palestinian people that began before 1948 and continues to this day. So when we look at an illustration like this, which is another BADIL production, in order to establish a homeland for the Jews, the Zionist movement knew that they needed to control the maximum amount of land with the minimum number of Palestinians. They knew Palestine was not a land without people, that there were people in Palestine. They knew that these people had national aspirations, and they knew that they would not leave freely. In other words, they would have to be forced to go. And so from the get-go, the Zionist movement decided on a policy of transfer or forcing the indigenous inhabitants, the Palestinian people, out of Palestine and replacing them with a foreign settler colonial population. So the BADIL goes back to 1917 with the formation of the occupation by the British and the formation of the British Mandate for Palestine and the Balfour Declaration. During that period up until 1946-47, approximately 150,000 Palestinians were displaced from Mandatory Palestine, the vast majority losing their citizenship or nationality because of policies implemented by the British. Then in 1948, the Zionist militias, through a series of military plans, forcibly displaced and dispossessed 750,000 Palestinians. This would constitute the largest wave of displacement. Then in 1967, when Israel occupied the rest of Palestine, they displaced another 500,000 Palestinians. Some of them had already been displaced from the previous time, from 1948. And today we still continue to see significant displacement and dispossession through policies implemented by the Israeli regime. And we'll be talking about what that displacement and dispossession look like. The bottom line is that throughout our history, we have seen significant and continuous waves of displacement. Sometimes those waves peak and sometimes they bottom out, but the displacement and dispossession has not stopped. In addition to that, there's a continuous denial of return. So because of this, we have a situation in which the Palestinian population keeps dwindling and dwindling, and the Israeli regime is able to manipulate the demographic composition of Palestine. Now, since we are a legal organization and our focus is on international law and human rights, we use a very comprehensive rights-based approach. And I know that this might be a little mundane, but I think we all need to be on the same page in terms of when we talk about certain terminology. According to international law, there is a category called forcibly displaced persons. And within that category, there are two subcategories, refugees and IDPs, internally displaced persons. A refugee is an individual that has been forcibly displaced and is forced to cross an internationally recognized border. So Palestinian refugees who were displaced during the mandate and left Mandatory Palestine, or Palestinians who were displaced during the Nakba and left what came to be called Israel and entered into the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, or the surrounding countries, those individuals are referred to as refugees by international law. The same is true for Syrians fleeing Syria, for Afghanis fleeing Afghanistan, for Tibetans fleeing Tibet, et cetera, et cetera. If you are forcibly displaced but remain within the entity, you do not cross an internationally recognized border, then you are an internally displaced person or an IDP. An individual can be a refugee and an IDP at the same time, depending on how many times they have been displaced and where they have been displaced to. So for example, if we look at the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip, about 85% of that population are Palestinian refugees from 1948 and their descendants. However, during the series of wars that Israel implemented against the Gaza Strip, many of those individuals became internally displaced internally inside the area of the Gaza Strip. So potentially a person could be a refugee or an IDP many times over. And sadly, that's what the situation is. Another example would be Palestinian refugees who are in Syria. There's also about 500,000 Palestinian refugees there. During the conflict in Syria, many of those individuals were displaced, became refugees again, and a more significant number became internally displaced inside Syria. In order to understand the concept of refugees and IDPs, we have to understand the concept of force, because these are individuals that have been forcibly displaced or transferred. So there is a notion of force. And international law identifies two types of force. One is what we call the traditional force, which is the force that is derived from armed and violent conflict. What we saw in 1948, what we saw in 1967 during the wars on Gaza, World War I, World War II, what's going on in Syria, et cetera, et cetera. The violent physical removal of people or groups from their place of origin and habitual residence. And this is the easiest type of force to see, or the easiest type of force to recognize. You have armed conflict, people flee, people are forced into other areas, forced to seek refuge or to run to preserve their lives, and so on and so forth. The second type of force recognized by international law is the creation of a coercive environment. And the creation of a coercive environment basically means the creation of a situation that is so unbearable that an individual really has no choice but to leave his place of origin or habitual residence. Now, the coercive environment is caused by the denial of fundamental rights. What kind of fundamental rights are we talking about? Fundamental rights such as access to water, access to healthcare, access to education, adequate housing, livelihoods, the right to life, the right to family unification, freedom of movement, freedom from oppression, and so on and so forth. So any of the basic rights that are identified by international law, once they are violated, they create a situation in which there could be or there is a coercive environment. Now, unfortunately for us, Israel is quite adept at using both types of force, and they continue to use both the force from armed and violent conflict and the creation of a coercive environment through a set of laws, whether civil or military orders, that create a situation for Palestinian which really doesn't allow them to access their basic and fundamental rights. Now, if you recall, I said in 1948, the Zionist militias were able to sweep through Palestine and basically ethnically cleanse Palestine of about 80% of its population at that time. It constituted about 750,000 Palestinians who became refugees, and another 40 to 60,000 that became internally displaced inside what came to be called Israel. In order to deal with this crisis, the United Nations created two agencies, UNRWA and the UNCCP. UNRWA is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, and UNRWA was mandated to provide humanitarian aid and assistance to Palestinian refugees and IDPs. Unfortunately, UNRWA UNRWA has been in the news quite a lot lately, particularly since the Trump administration decided to defund the agency. They often struggle with funding. They often struggle with being able to provide services. While in the beginning, they were providing things like food, blankets, medicines, tents, clothing, et cetera, et cetera. As the Palestinian refugee situation became more protracted, UNRWA became a service delivery type of organization. And the three main services they provide are healthcare, education, and social services. And so every 3 years, UNRWA has to raise the funds in order to provide these core services to Palestinian refugees. And it's getting much harder and harder for UNRWA to be able to do this. So they're not really able to fulfill their mandate in a way that is adequate, both in quality and quantity of services. The other agency that was created for for Palestinian refugees is the UNCCP, and that's the United Nations Conciliation Commission on Palestine. The UNCCP was created in the same resolution as UN Resolution 194, and that is the main UN resolution that speaks to the return, property restitution, and compensation of Palestinian refugees and IDPs. So the UNCCP was created within this document, within UN Resolution 194, in order to facilitate, coordinate, and implement the return of Palestinian refugees and IDPs. The UNCCP became defunct 5 to about 10 years after it was created. And doesn't have any operational activities. It continues to exist today sort of as like a ghost organization of the UN. Every year they submit a report to the UN that says no progress has been made. And it's true, because no progress has been made. To this day, not one single Palestinian refugee and IDP is allowed to exercise his or her right of return. Now, why would the UN do this? Why would they create 2 organizations to provide humanitarian aid and assistance and to facilitate the right of return of Palestinian refugees and IDPs? It wasn't out of the goodness of their hearts. It's because international law dictates that that is what is supposed to happen. These are entitlements that are owed to individuals who have been forcibly displaced and dispossessed. So this is not a situation that is unique to Palestinian refugees. The only thing that is unique about our situation is that when the Nakba happened, there was no agency in place with the UN in order to deal with refugee crises. This didn't occur until 1951 with the advent of the 1951 Refugee Convention and the creation of UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Now, this is the other UN agency that is mandated to deal with refugee and IDP populations. And the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, mandates within its both assignments, let's say, to provide humanitarian aid and assistance and to facilitate return within one agency. Now, the reason that there was a separate framework created for Palestinian refugees was to ensure that Palestinian refugees would be able to exercise their rights or to receive these entitlements, both of physical protection and the ability to return. However, it backfired because of the lack of political will that existed at that time and continues to exist today. So even though we have 2 agencies dedicated to our international protection, Palestinian refugees and IDPs are actually probably the most marginalized displaced population in the world. Now, since we have a situation of ongoing displacement and dispossession and the ongoing denial of return, we have a situation that has also created the largest and most protracted refugee population in the world. Now, one of the BADIL is a resource organization. So one of the things that we produce is called the Survey of Palestinian Refugees and IDPs. And this is a research piece that we produce every couple of years to try to provide the most updated situation on Palestinian refugees and IDPs, including statistics, socioeconomic situation, any changes in the political or legal environment that we may be subject to, or any types of additional obstacles that we may face. Now, sadly, 66% of the Palestinian population constitutes refugees and or IDPs. We're talking about 8.7 million people in total. And we kind of have to like wrap our heads around this number, 66%, and of course counting. But 66% means that out of every 10 Palestinians you meet, 7 of them will have experienced displacement at least once in their lifetime, with significant numbers having experienced it more than once. I'm going to stop the slideshow there. Whoops, that's not stopping it. Oh, sorry. There we go. Okay. Okay. The way Israel has been able to control and manipulate the demographic composition of Palestine and establish itself as a somewhat legitimate, or not necessarily, establish some kind of legitimacy with the international community is through the use of a variety of prohibitions under international law. We talked about one of the main ones, which is the forcible displacement and transfer of the Palestinian people. This constitutes a crime under international law and requires that the international community acts. At the same time, Israel is bringing in a settler colonial population, and so is using colonialism as one of the ways to manipulate the demographic composition and also control the land of mandatory Palestine through de facto and de jure annexation, which is also another prohibition under international law. The colonialism component of the Israeli regime is something I think that the people of Hawaii can relate to, because there is definitely a situation of colonialism happening in Hawaii. It has a different it may have different mechanisms applied in that instance, but the end result is the same, and that is the control of the indigenous population, the control of the resources, the control of the land, and the control of the government or the regime that has been put in place to manipulate that situation. So at the end, we have a denial of self-determination of a national people or a group of people. There's also other layers of the Israeli regime that besides colonialism, and that is apartheid. Israel has a significant number of laws that they have instituted in both its civil in its civil laws, its national laws, as well as in the military orders that they apply in the occupied territory of 1967. The end result is the creation of a legal hierarchy that controls the destiny of every single Palestinian, regardless of where they happen to reside, whether they are residing inside what is now Israel and have Palestinian citizenship, whether they are Palestinians with Jerusalem residency inside Jerusalem, whether they are in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, or whether they are in any other country in exile, the Arab countries or the European countries. BADIL as an organization, as I said, works to defend and to promote the rights of the Palestinian people, specifically those that have been forcibly displaced and transferred, and those who are about to be displaced and transferred. Because we are a human rights organization and do not provide humanitarian aid and assistance, we are often perceived to be radical because we call for the right of return of Palestinian refugees and IDPs. And this makes because of the current political climate, it makes it very difficult for us to recruit partners for BADIL that would provide funding. Now, we've always experienced a difficulty with this issue, but I can say that having been with BADIL for the last 10 years, it was certainly, the political climate was much friendlier when I first came to the organization than what it is today. There is definitely animosity, let's say, towards an organization like BADIL. We are the only organization that attacks the refugee issue or addresses the refugee issue from a human rights perspective, calling for the right of return of all Palestinian refugees and IDPs as dictated by international law. Another issue that has compounded this funding situation for BADIL is the advent of politically conditional funding. Significant numbers of institutional donors, particularly Europe. I mean, this was the situation in the US in 2001 when they instituted political funding with the ATC clause, the anti-terrorism measures that they put into place for their funding. We saw last year in 2018 the advent of similar clauses in the EU contracts, as well as their individual member states. Basically, what these clauses do is they criminalize historic Palestinian resistance, regulating resistance or equating it with terrorism, and therefore criminalize our political parties and factions. And so it prevents us from being able to get that funding that we need because of these clauses, and we are against making that acknowledgement that these parties are terrorists. In terms of equating our struggles with people from around the world, the international legal framework was created, yes, by the powerful white Europeans. It was created as a system of checks and balances in order to protect the unprotected. And so a list, or let's say a laundry list of do's and don'ts were created by the international legal framework. And the main do's, of course, is the fulfillment of human rights. As individuals, regardless of the color of our skin or where we reside or our religion or our gender preferences, we all have a basic set of human rights as dictated by international law. And we all struggle from instances or situations in which those human rights are violated. In terms of Palestine and the Palestinians, we are, I believe, the litmus test for the international legal framework, because even though the legal framework has been applied to other situations, so let's say former apartheid South Africa, in which liberation was achieved from apartheid by using the legal framework as well as other mechanisms or other tools at the disposal of the South Africans. We are also using those same tools, but for some reason, there is a hesitancy or a reluctance, a significant reluctance on the part of the international community to hold Israel accountable for its violations of international law and human rights. And so if we can't uphold the international legal framework for Palestine and the Palestinians, we will come to a situation in which we can't uphold it for anyone. And that would include, for example, the people of Hawaii, the people of Tibet, the people of Armenia, and so on and so forth. So I'll stop there and maybe take some questions.
Well, let me, on behalf of everybody, thank you for this brilliant set of information. We're so overwhelming and refreshing to hear all of this. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. Thank you for touching on a lot of other things for sure. We can continue the conversation if anybody just wants to
jump in.
For sure. Yeah, go for it. Just, hop in.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was enlightening and wonderful. Um, a couple of questions, quick ones. You mentioned the survey of Palestinian refugees and IDPs, and
Mhm.
I was wondering in terms of your relations with other organizations, like Salman Abu Sitta, for instance, is very active, has
Mhm.
been for like since probably he left Palestine in
Mhm.
such matters. If you would elaborate on those kinds of relations, if any, that's
Mhm.
one. And then the other thing, like you mentioned, Oslo and all of that. So I was wondering, does the Palestinian National Authority have an alternative for BADIL, or do they like relate to BADIL, so to speak?
To answer the first question, BADIL is a very small organization. It always has been. Because of the nature of the work that we do and because we take very principled positions on a number of issues. Um, and because we are a small organization, the way we have the scope and the reach that we have, and the way we are able to keep our relationship with Palestinians and our constituency, with Palestinian refugees and IDPs, regardless of where they reside, is through partnerships. So we have nurtured, created, initiated, maintained partnerships all over the world, particularly where Palestinian refugee communities reside. And we have created in 2015 what we call the Global Palestinian Refugee Network, which is a network of about 45 Palestinian organizations, both here in mandatory Palestine, so on both sides of the Green Line, as well as abroad. And we, of course, keep growing this network of organizations so that we are able to cooperate with them and to work with them and to support their work as well. So we have a significant, let's say, Palestinian partnerships. The other thing that we do, of course, is partner with international civil society organizations. So we have a number of international civil society organizations, and we would consider the Return Center and the work of Salman Abu Sitta as a Palestinian expert on the refugee situation and return in accordance with those types of partnerships. We try to connect with partners with the internationals, with organizations and movements working on international solidarity for Palestine. Before the COVID-19 situation, we used to have, or we started an international mobilization course in which we hold a course for 10 days in Palestine and provide lectures and briefings and tours and show the members of the international solidarity movement and organizations of international civil society, the situation on the ground, to try to create more consistency and more coordination for activism and international solidarity abroad. And one of the things we focus on, of course, is the discourse. What are we saying about Palestine? Are we calling it occupied? Because it's not just occupied. And according to international law, that's the lowest, let's say, or that's the least of the evils within international law. Are we saying it's colonized? Because this is the actual situation on the ground. Are we saying that Israel is an apartheid regime? This is the actual situation on the ground. And these kind of things are things that we focus on, identifying the reality that exists in Palestine. In terms of the Palestinian Authority, I mean, we try to work with them on a number of different things in the same way that because we are a human rights organization, when they feel that they are not acting in the best interest of the Palestinian people, particularly Palestinian refugees and IDPs, and when they are implementing or attempting to implement acts or legislation that go against international law and human rights, we speak up. And so we're not their favorite organization, that's for sure. We have, if you know the track record of the Palestinian Authority, you know that they have not been performing adequately since Oslo. And even Oslo in and of itself, I think, is a tragedy that has been imposed on the Palestinian people, and has the consequences of Oslo have been even worse than the actual Nakba. Because if we look at the situation on the ground, Oslo has, one of the things that Oslo has achieved is a situation in which not only are we being suppressed by the Israelis and the Israeli regime, but we also have a situation of suppression and repression from the authority as well. And the situation that has been created is a dwindling of real resistance, or the proper type of resistance in order to be able to liberate Palestine. And so, yes, even though we continue to try to influence the Palestinian Authority, we are on, let's say, not so very, our relationship with them is not the best. And it's because of the things that they do, and the things that they say, and how they are handling the situation, both here in Palestine and abroad. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to say that I put the BADIL website in the chat, and I have a very practical question and then another kind of question. The practical question is, I didn't see a donate button, but is it possible for us to support your organization if we want to send in a donation? That's the practical question. Maybe I'll just ask you that one first, and then I have a not so practical question.
Why don't you go ahead and give me the next one, and I can answer them both.
Okay. I just wanted to ask you, in terms of solidarity politics, what you kind of think is effective. And I was particularly interested in what you see as the possibilities for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, especially given the kind of impending and almost de facto annexation of the West Bank that we're seeing, and how does that change things if it does? But just what do you think people in the international community can do most effectively? So thanks.
Sure. In terms of donating, this is one of the things that we struggle with, because we are considered a red zone. People, and there's concerns about terrorism and money laundering. It is very difficult for us to establish that those kinds of programs, or have access to those kinds of programs where we can receive funds. Anything that enters or leaves Palestine is scrutinized. And so this is an additional layer of our funding difficulties. We have tried to establish, and we do have significant friends across all over the world who want to donate and support to BADIL, and support BADIL's work through funding and through other ways. But unfortunately, we don't have the ability to be able to set up that type of situation. And so this creates a dependence on institutional funding from INGOs, international non-government organizations, which, as I said previously, are implementing these conditional funding clauses. So there's less and less institutional organizations that we can approach for funding. And so we are looking at a situation in 2021 where we will actually have half of the necessary budget that we need to be able to continue to do the work that we have done in the past. So unfortunately, the answer is no. There is no way really to donate to BADIL. In terms of solidarity politics, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the current situation in the West Bank with the annexation plans with Israel. One of the things I find, first of all, I want to say thank you to the International Solidarity Movement and all the organizations and all the people who have worked very hard to bring Palestine to the fore. And I don't want to lessen the work of the international solidarity movement and all the different organizations that have been involved. But I do have to say that I see maybe 3 weaknesses, or let's say 3 areas for improvement. One of them is the discourse of the international solidarity movement, how they describe the situation on the ground, and how it is presented. This is very important. We can't just talk about occupation. We can't just talk about the occupation of the 1967 territory. We have to take a position in which we talk about the colonization of Palestine from the Balfour Declaration onward. We have to present Israel, or speak of Israel, as a colonial apartheid regime, because this is prohibited under international law. Occupation is not prohibited under international law. It's not illegal, it's permissible. And so without describing the situation as it is, the reality that we face on the ground, we have very little chance of actually resolving the situation in the way it should be resolved. We should not be talking about land swaps, as the deal of the century talks about. We should not be talking about the de facto annexation of the West Bank, because this is also prohibited. We should not be talking about reducing the number of refugees by creating a new definition for refugees, as the deal of the century suggests. So it's all because this is because we are not framing and we are not speaking to the core issues that make up the conflict. We're talking about the periphery, the things, the consequences of those core issues, which is annexation and home demolitions and imprisonment and unifying Jerusalem and all of this. We need to really touch upon the core, and this is missing in the international solidarity movement. This is missing. And this is why we created the course that I spoke about earlier. The other thing that I see, and this is not the situation with this particular group, is that the voices that speak on Palestine are not Palestinian. Oftentimes they're Israelis. They're Israeli Jews from Israel, not from Israel. They're Israeli Jews who are residing in colonized territory in Palestine. And there is significant weight or significant attention attached to these types of speakers, more so than Palestinian speakers. And now, as I said, this isn't the case for this group, but oftentimes I've been asked to speak alongside an Israeli. And I find this to be, particularly offensive, because I am a victim of human rights violations, even though I don't like to be perceived as the victim, but I am oppressed, and they want me to speak alongside my oppressor. And this I find to be really revolting. Or we should have a balanced conversation between Israelis and Palestinians, because why? The oppressor has the upper hands, the oppressed don't. Where is the balance there? And why should I or any other Palestinian accept or be forced to present or to speak as if the power struggle is equal? There is a huge power struggle. There's a huge imbalance of power between Palestinians and Israelis. So no, we don't accept that. It's not to say that there are certain Israelis that do not speak, that do not have, that present perhaps the Palestinian situation as it is. For example, Ilan Pappé. Ilan Pappé has a very progressive position on Palestine, but even so, he is still an individual that is able to reap the rewards of a colonial apartheid regime. And there should be no reason that his opinion on Palestine or his analysis of Palestine should be more than, let's say, BADIL's opinion on Palestine or another Palestinian organization's analysis on Palestine. The third, let's say, area that I see needs to be worked or needs to be improved is the consistency of solidarity. When there is a war on Gaza, the solidarity movement is very active. And in the last 3 wars on Gaza, we saw significant movement, significant activity from the solidarity movement, and we really appreciated that. It's not that we didn't appreciate it. But where is the consistency? Where is the constant pressure? Where is the accumulation of pressure, the accumulation of the solidarity movement? So we create this tide that can turn the situation around. In other words, we need civil society, the international solidarity movement, to influence political opinion and political will so that we can have a situation in which Israel is held accountable according to international law. Oh, and BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions is a recognized or legitimate form of non-armed resistance that is an entitlement to oppressed peoples. What Israel has done with the BDS movement and the international community has allowed this to happen is that it has equated BDS with terrorism. And so another tool of resistance has almost been neutralized. I'm not saying that it has been neutralized, but it's trying to be, Israel is trying to neutralize BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, by equating it with the terrorism. And the international community is allowing that to happen. And when I say international community, I mean states. And states needs to be influenced by international civil society. So there needs to be a push from the ground, from international civil society towards states, so that we don't criminalize, let's say, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. We don't call Palestinian factions terrorist organizations, and we don't impose these kinds of beliefs and this belief or this mentality, which is a colonial mentality, on the oppressed people, the colonized people.
Thank you. That was great. And that funding question was meant to be a simple one, and it wasn't.
I know.
And that's
there are no simple questions.
There are no simple questions.
Nope.
And yeah, it's an interesting.
It's a conundrum. I mean, it's really a dilemma, because I know that if we had that venue open to us, if we could find a way to somehow receive individual donations, we could be completely independent from the institutional funding partners or the institutional funding framework. And that would mean that we would be able to do so much more, so much better, because we wouldn't be limited by the priorities of the donor and the restrictions of the donor. In addition to the conditional funding clauses, organizations who have funded BADIL have told us, don't do anything on refugees. I mean, come on, we're a refugee organization. You want to fund us, but you don't want us to do anything on refugees? Don't talk about the Nakba. Don't call Israel a colonial apartheid regime. Yes, we get this kind of feedback from our donors. And so of course they're not our donors anymore, but the pool that we are trying to get funding from keeps shrinking and shrinking. And so this has created a situation where, you know, how are we going to continue to operate, and what are we going to do when that pool becomes, when it, and these are things that we are trying to address as an organization. So
yeah, could I ask you about the International Criminal Court and the cases that have been brought by the Center for Constitutional Rights and the banning of ICC prosecutors from the U.S. because of these cases, both on war crimes for U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, and also for these cases brought against Israel on behalf of Palestine. Thank you.
Well, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, like the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is another legal avenue. It's a tool that we can use to try to get accountability for Israel, to try to get justice for the Palestinian people. just like it's a tool for any other oppressed community or oppressed group of people to use those international mechanisms that are available to us. So the backlash is not surprising. I mean, of course, there's going to be backlash against the ICC. There's going to be backlash against the ICJ, even backlash against the UN. I mean, Israel is always saying that the UN is biased, that they are anti-Semitic, and they have boycotted the UN. And it's very reminiscent of Israel denying the commissions of inquiry that the UN sets up for Palestine, the ones that were supposed to come and investigate the wars, for example. These special rapporteurs that they continue to deny access to Palestine. And so these mechanisms are being used by states, or because Israel is able to get away with it, then other states are also trying to get away with it, the US. And sooner or later, other states are going to try to get away with it because Israel has kind of poked these holes into the international legal regime, and the international community again has allowed it. And so we're going to see a deterioration of these international legal frameworks that were set up to protect us and to hold states in line. And we're going to see more of these backlashes against these neutral, or let's say protective mechanisms that were put in place by the international community. In addition to that, I would like to say that the legal frameworks or the legal avenue is only one of the pathways. There are many other pathways or many other mechanisms and tools that we should avail ourselves of. And that, of course, it was mentioned by Cynthia, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. This is another pathway. Popular resistance or mass movements, including civil disobedience. And here I'm talking about this Palestinians and the Palestinian resistance movement, as well as armed resistance. Armed resistance is sanctioned under international law. We have the right to resist with any means necessary, including both armed and non-armed resistance. Now, having said that and identified, I hope, most of the pathways, there are some that are viable and strategic to use and some that are not. Obviously, the path of armed resistance is not viable and not strategic to use at this time. But that doesn't mean that that path of resistance is not available to us and to others who are experiencing the same type of oppression and resistance, oppression and human rights violations and crimes. And it should be an avenue that isn't equated with terrorism. This is very important as well. So remember when I was saying how we talk about Palestine, we should not equate Palestinian resistance with terrorism. And this is something that the international solidarity movement kind of shies away from. They prefer to be engaged with organizations that promote peaceful or beautiful resistance. But since everything has been equated with terrorism, we know even boycott, divestment, and sanctions, we need to step up, or the international solidarity movement needs to step up with the Palestinians and say, no, this is not terrorism, this is resistance, this is an entitlement. And so if this pathway needs to be taken, or if this pathway is made available, then it should be taken, and it should be recognized as something legitimate.
Can I say?
Yes.
Unless someone else wants to say something who hasn't talked yet, I don't know. But anyway, I didn't hear any objection. I will go forward. You know, in terms of discourse, I agree with you completely that the discourse has to be revamped, shall we say, and deal with facts on the ground, you know, concrete issues on the ground, like, you know, the apartheid state of Israel, or I would call the Zionist entity in Palestine, you know. Anyway, so that's important. But also in terms of discourse is the notion of that goes, you know, no one criticizes it, you know, it's uncritical, this notion of the international community. And sometimes the international community, as like the West talks about it, it's like the US, Britain, France, and Germany, shall we say, you know, maybe a few more guys on the West, yeah? So we have to challenge that notion of international community as well, it seems to me, you know? And when the US talks about, well, the international community, blah, 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 well, tell them, who are you talking about? Russia is not saying this, for instance, or China or what have you, you know, that's one. The other thing, you know, in terms of things like BDS that is really, you know, being criminalized for obvious reasons. So can one imagine then if somebody like says armed struggle is something that needs to be done? You go to like, you know, black site somewhere in Europe or East Europe or something like that. Be that as it may, you know, I'm looking at different contexts for the Palestinian people. You know, for instance, the West Bank and Gaza as two different spaces. One has armed struggle in it, which is Gaza, and the other doesn't because like the Palestinian National Authority has security coordination with the state of Israel and Palestine, or the Zionist entity. So it reminds me of the Lebanese army of the South that really collaborated with the Israelis when the Zionists were occupying Lebanon. You know, they were doing their dirty work for the Israelis. You know, I mean, so I just wanted to say that it all depends upon where you are as a Palestinian and what is the most suitable kind of struggle. You know, whether it is this, that, or the other, or a combination thereof. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you, Ibrahim, 100%. And I think that yes, we need to choose, and we need to, but I still think that we need to be consistent in our analysis of the situation. And one of the things that has hindered the Palestinian struggle is this lack of unified voice. And the advent of Oslo and the creation of the Palestinian Authority has further fractured or further created divisions in the discourse. So you hardly ever hear, for example, the PA talking about the right of return. They don't talk about it anymore. They don't talk about it. They talk about East Jerusalem as opposed to Jerusalem. They talk about the West Bank. What the heck is the West Bank? I mean, that's something that was created after Israel took over the vast majority of mandatory Palestine. All of a sudden, we have this thing called the West Bank. It's a colonial term. It didn't even exist prior to the creation of the Zionist entity. The Gaza Strip. Again, it's another colonial term. And so we keep having this conversation through the dictates of the colonial entity. And this is a problem. In terms of armed struggle, I wasn't calling for armed struggle. I was saying that it was, and we have this conversation often in BADIL, because as a human rights organization, we have certain limitations. We are limited, let's say, by the frameworks of international law and human rights. And at the same time, we are freed by them. But we do have a right to armed struggle. And this, I think, needs to be recognized by the international community, whether it exists or not. And the advent of criminalizing BDS and criminalizing our factions by calling them terrorists is how the international community is chipping away at the notion of legitimate armed resistance or the right to resist. And this is very crucial, I think, not only for us as Palestinians, but for other oppressed people who are facing colonial regimes, who are facing oppression, whose rights are being violated and marginalized. The PA, in my opinion, is the security arm of the Zionist entity. Israel no longer has to, even though they continue to manipulate Palestinians inside the West Bank and of course in the Gaza Strip. They continue to manipulate through the PA. And it has created this kind of facade that we supposedly have peace because we have the Oslo Accords and we are constantly negotiating. We are constantly being called to come to the table and negotiate for peace. But the fact of the matter is, it's that we have a situation in which the levels of oppression have shifted once again, and there is additional layers that have been created through the creation of the Palestinian Authority. And that has coincided with the deterioration of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So now the line between the two is completely gone. And we have this situation in the West Bank where the Palestinian Authority has this security coordination going on and this dependency on the Israelis and on the Oslo Accords that is not conducive to our liberation.
Yeah, just one follow-up quick, if I may. In Lebanon, I'm a Palestinian refugee, but I grew up in Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
In Lebanon, we call that security coordination between Lebanese armed people who collaborated with Israel as traitors, and
Absolutely.
so that and I call the Palestinian National Authority myself from position of security here in the U.S. as traitors. I meant no word.
And I would have to agree with you. And then there is a term for it as well, besides the one that you used, and that's normalization. I mean, we're very upset with the Emirates for signing a peace agreement with Israel, but we were the first normalizers. We were the ones that made it okay with Oslo. And so how are you trying to hold the Emirates accountable for not standing beside the Palestinian people when you have done the same thing yourself earlier?
Yeah, and another thing, like in terms of, you mentioned the PLO and the PNA and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
The seeds, the bad seeds of the creation of Oslo sown, then Al-Fatah organization, for instance, and later on the PLO, have been sown way before. I would say from from the 1970s, from like say 1974, 75, the beginning of the civil war in Lebanon. I just to let you know, I can talk a lot about that thing, but no need now.
Is there anyone else who had questions or would like to contribute to the conversation at all? Oh, go ahead.
Aloha, Lubnah. I just wanted to thank you for your clarity and your candor. Your talk was so rich. I'm still chewing all of it. I did want to note that some of my takeaways were the different terms of engagement and the rhetoric that's been used and the consistency of our building of solidarity. Those sound really important to me. I was also interested and really horrified to see your statistics of 66% displacement. That's just heartbreaking. Here in Hawaii, although we still see our lands, we also are disconnected from them. And I'm part of a movement to try and what we call return, ho'i ka aina, to return to the land. So your particular struggles are very much in my heart. I was interested in a little bit of what you were saying with the UN, because our communities are constantly trying to go to the UN to set precedents, and from my analysis, it hasn't really made much progress. We haven't seen much success. And I heard you say that although some of the groups still exist within that, they're not active. There's no teeth to it. Can you say anything more about that?
Sure. First of all, I would think that the situation in Hawaii is very similar to what Palestinian internally displaced persons experience. While the native population of Hawaii hasn't been forced out of Hawaii, and I apologize because my information or my knowledge on this issue is quite limited, but from what I understood or from what I know so far is that there is a situation of control of the land and natural resources in such a way that people are being pushed into the into pockets of concentrated pockets of urbanized centers, and so the ability to roam free on the land and be able to use the land in the traditional way in which the people have been used to doing before the colonization is no longer available. And this falls into that creation of a coercive environment type of situation, and really relegates a very limited type of existence in terms of how the indigenous people and how the native people have been used to living, or the life experience that they are used to having. And this is a very similar thing to what's happening in Palestine. So I just wanted to say that. In terms of the legal frameworks, they're only as good as how much they are enforced. The international legal framework and the mechanisms contained therein are fantastic on paper. They're fantastic on paper. There's hundreds of resolutions on Palestine. There's hundreds of UN reports. There's hundreds, thousands of submissions detailing the human rights violations and the crimes. There's hundreds of recommendations coming out of the UN to hold Israel accountable, but without actually taking practical measures, without actually taking steps to hold Israel accountable through the myriad of options available to the UN and member states, Israel is going to continue to commit human rights violations and crimes. The problem with the UN system or the international legal system is that it's implemented in a biased way based on the imbalance of power. Ibrahim was talking about how when we talk about the international community, we talk about specific states. Well, the sad fact of the matter is that those are the states that are in power. And those states are with Israel, because they are essentially colonial states as well. When we talk about the US, I mean, Great Britain, the UK was the king colonizer and continues to be. And they set forth they put in motion the Balfour Declaration, which is a purely colonial tool that they used. Having said that, should we completely abandon the legal frameworks or the legal avenues? I don't think so. I think that we can use or should continue to use the myriad of or the various mechanisms and tools that we have available to us. It also helps us to push forth the discourse, because instead of talking about Israel as an occupier, we talk about Israel as a colonial regime, as an apartheid regime. And we have to influence, in the end, it's the decisions that are made by these governments that will bring Israel in line with international law. It's our job as civil society, whether it's Palestinian civil society or international civil society, to ensure that our governments do what they are supposed to do in protecting us and protecting others by following the dictates of the international legal framework. And this is what the solidarity movement and Palestinian civil society needs to do, is to create this pressure on our governments so that they do fall in line with international law. And this is exactly what happened with former apartheid South Africa. The pressure from international civil society and the resistance movement in South Africa, and the shaming and naming, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions finally pervaded and influenced the UN to encourage states to put embargoes and to put sanctions on the apartheid regime of South Africa. And this is what brought it down eventually. But the resistance movement of South Africa also used armed resistance. Armed resistance wasn't absent. Just to say. So I think we should use whatever mechanisms are available to us and whatever mechanisms we can use strategically, and those that will have effect And so while the legal frameworks are cumbersome and they take a long time, I don't think that we should abandon them. And I think we can definitely use them to frame the discourse so that we can motivate and coordinate and bring people on to the international solidarity movement and on the side of the Palestinian people. And I think they're useful for that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, any final thoughts from anybody before we wrap up?
On occupation,
Mm-hmm.
as a legal thing, you said this occupation, the notion or the concept of occupation is not illegal under international law. So that's one thing. And why I raise it here, because there are some Hawaiian activists talk about occupation, like Hawaii is occupied, and they follow it in Geneva and other places, in terms of, dealing with international organizations, etc., to shed light on the plight of the indigenous Hawaiian people. So I just, it's interesting to me that some people here put a lot of emphasis on occupation, and then what you just said about that makes me like maybe try to rethink, avenues of struggle for Hawaiians here or something like that, or maybe Hawaiians would want to revisit that and figure out what might work, might not work,
Yep.
or what might be standing on solid ground when they say something about occupation or colonization or whatever it is. So I just wanted to, for our Hawaiian brothers and sisters, to really maybe revisit that and figure out maybe we are wrong and they are right. I don't know, but you know what I mean? Yeah, just that.
I just want to clarify that when we talk about occupation, it's as I said, it's not illegal per se, it's permissible. And it's considered the consequence of armed conflict. However, it's not meant to be a permanent situation. It should be temporary. This is one. The second thing is that there are certain rules that have to be adhered to by the occupier. They have an obligation to protect the occupied people and the occupied territory. They are not allowed to change the demographic composition. They are not allowed to implant settlers. They are not allowed to change the laws of the occupied people. But Israel has violated each and every one of these restrictions, each and every one of the parameters of occupation. So while occupation in and of itself is not illegal and is permissible, what Israel has done under the guise of occupation is absolutely illegal and prohibited by international law. The reason we don't like to use occupation is, as I said, it's the lesser. It's not the most accurate description of the situation in Palestine. There are other descriptive there's other legal terminology that describes it better, that creates a situation in which the international community, if international duty bearers like the UN and member states, if they acknowledge that Israel is an apartheid and colonial regime, international law actually dictates that they must act. So this acknowledgement is very important. And this is what kicked off the situation in former apartheid South Africa. Now, as to how to describe or how to frame the situation in Hawaii, this would be something that should be, this is something that should be dictated by the native people of Hawaii, in the same way as we Palestinians must articulate our situation. And the way that we articulate and describe it, the way we frame it, is the the foundation for what the international community uses or the international solidarity movement uses. They must take their lead from us. And that is how it should be the same way for the people of Hawaii. Now, in terms of the technicality of it, from what I know, and again, I will say that my knowledge is very limited, from what I know about the situation in Hawaii, and this is from a completely outsider perspective and someone who has knowledge between the difference between occupation and colonization, I would say that the colonial framework fits there. But again, this is an opinion coming from someone who understands the frameworks, but doesn't necessarily know the reality on the ground in Hawaii. But from what I've heard and what I've read, I would imagine that the colonial framework works. With more information, if you're interested, Mahia, in having a conversation about using that framework, I would be more than happy to have a one-on-one conversation and talk about that and see if the colonial framework actually works for you.